Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Greetings from Washington, D.C. And we are very excited to bring December month's webinar to you. And I'm just going to give a few minutes when people are logging in. And we have lots of interest on this topic from people around the world. And the registration has exceeded from 40 countries. So we expecting a fairly pretty good number of people joining in. And this webinar is simultaneously broadcasted on our Facebook Live, on our Facebook page of International Development Institute. And it will also be put together later in the YouTube channel. And it will go out, the link will go out to people who couldn't attend, or people who attended, they also will get a link, so you can share with your colleagues and at your work or your other colleagues. So without further delay, my job is here to introduce IDI and our speaker, our colleague, Elinor. So IDI is based in Washington, D.C. with our presence in Kenya, Nigeria, and Nepal. And we have been doing procurement, mostly training, capacity building, and policy reform work for the last several years in a number of countries on donor-funded projects or directly with procurement authorities. And we have been doing these procurement webinars for the last couple of years, almost every month. And so this month's topic, as you all know, what you have signed up for. So with this month topic is where to start sustainable procurement, public procurement. So you rather hear our speaker than me. So my job is to quickly introduce her, who she is, and many of you have probably worked with Suzanne, and you already know about her. She has worked in over 2 decades in about I don't even know how many countries, Susanna, you have worked, and you have worked in probably over 25, 30 countries, if I'm not mistaken. And she has worked, I can go over the list of a couple of the countries like Uganda, Eswatini, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Malawi, Botswana, Ethiopia, and you name any African country from east to west, north to south, and in Asia as well, and in Caribbean islands. And her expertise are drafting public procurement laws and regulations, designing capacity development strategies, and delivering impactful training programs. And she is in London right now. She has a bachelor's in European Studies from University of Leicester and master's in public procurement law and policy from University of Nottingham. So without further delay, I'll bring her on, but there are some housekeeping. So what we're going to use, if we're going to try to make it as interactive as we can. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and put your questions in chat box or in comments or Q&A, and we will pick it up from Q&A, and we will we will come back to those questions once Elinor finishes her presentation for about 25-30 minutes. We'll have good 20 minutes for Q&A. I will also collect questions if that comes through Facebook, and we'll try to combine them. We'll see how it goes. So without further delays, Elinor, all yours.
Thank you very much, Suman, and thanks to IDI for giving me the opportunity to talk to you today. Let me share my screen and we can get started. So as Suman said, we're going to talk about sustainable public procurement and where to start. Now, I'm conscious that this is a huge subject. We have over 40 different countries represented here today. Every country is different. It has a different starting point. It has different goals. It has different priorities. So we can't possibly cover everything, but I'm going to try and give some tips and some examples from the countries that I'm familiar with that would be of use to everybody. I've been working for the last few years to manage a capacity development program on sustainable public procurement, and we've worked across 12 countries, 6 in Africa, 3 in Latin America, and we have started designing the program in some countries in Eastern Europe as well. So I'll draw some examples from those, but I know there's very many more countries on here today with different experiences too. So we'll start with a quick introduction to sustainable public procurement to check we're all kind of on the same page, talking about the same thing. Some tips on where to get started, and then we'll go in a bit more depth on how to integrate sustainability into your procurement systems and practices. So starting just by introducing SPP, the first question for some people is, why does public procurement need to think about sustainability? Surely that's for someone else to work on. Surely that's a different ministry's responsibility. It's not procurement's task. But we really can't escape sustainability issues in procurement. Every contract we place has implications for sustainability, whether it's about raw materials, production processes, packaging, transport, disposal at end of life, waste from production processes, labour standards. There are just so many issues where public procurement touches on sustainability that it just can't be ignored. So I'm going to put up here a quite commonly accepted definition of sustainable public procurement. You'll see other definitions around, but they all have the same kind of common factors in there. I'm not going to read you the whole definition. You can see that for yourself, but I just want to highlight a couple of things here. First of all, it starts out reading like any definition of public procurement. It's still about buying goods, works and services that an organisation needs. So we haven't totally changed our approach. A lot of what is familiar to public procurement is still the same in sustainable public procurement. But then you'll see at the end of the definition, it starts talking about benefits to society and the economy and about minimising damage to the environment. And that's where sustainable procurement starts to move a little bit beyond the organisation and to start thinking more widely. So as you saw in that definition, there's really 3 pillars to sustainable public procurement. A lot of people tend to think it's just about environmental issues, and you will hear talk about green public procurement and circular public procurement and a lot of very similar concepts. But the important thing about sustainable public procurement is it's very broad and it brings in economic and social and environmental issues. Of course, you might not be able to tackle all those issues in a single procurement. It's very much about deciding what's important, prioritising, deciding what's relevant to each purchase. So it's not trying to do everything every time, but sustainable procurement is broad enough to give you the ability to tackle challenges in any of these 3 areas.
Elinor, sorry, are you sharing the screen? Yeah, we can't see it.
Sorry about that. Let me try again to share.
Yeah, it's coming now. Good.
Okay, apologies. Let me just go through. So you will see there the definition that I've just been talking about in terms of sustainable public procurement. And we were talking about 3 pillars there: economic, social and environmental. And then let me come back to the definition again and break it down a little bit more. So there's 4 big things in this definition. The first is what we've always known in public procurement, about public organisations meeting their need by buying goods, works and services. The second is around value for money, and that's not a new thing. Anyone who's worked in public procurement has been thinking about value for money for years. But there's a slightly different emphasis when we talk about whole life basis, which I'll come back to a bit more. But this is really thinking about the whole lifespan of goods, works or services, right through from their production through to disposal at end of life. And then we start coming to where we think beyond the organisation and we start thinking about the benefits for society or for the economy, not just for the organisation itself. And then we start thinking about the environment. And it's worded slightly differently there because there will always be some impact on the environment from whatever we purchase, but it's about minimising those negative impacts. So coming back to this idea of value for money, it's important that we look beyond just lowest price. So on the left-hand side, you will see a box there, which is very much about what is the focus of the organisation when it does procurement. So of course, it's going to think about what is the price, the initial purchase price of any asset. But it should also be thinking about what does it cost to use that asset, you know, to service it, to buy spare parts and to dispose of it at end of life. So that's what we would call the total cost of ownership. And it's the focus for the organisation and the cost that it will face itself, whether at initial purchase or perhaps slightly on during use of further on while using the product. When we move to the right-hand box there, you'll see we move on from just the organisation to focus on society, and we start to look at whole life cost or life cycle cost. So we still think about all the things in that left-hand box, the total cost of ownership, but we also start to think about what is the environmental, social or economic impact of this purchase, and to try and assess that and to build that into the procurement process. So to give an example that will probably be quite familiar to everybody, something probably a lot of people have got involved in buying, whether for themselves or for their employers, a vehicle. So if we take the example of a vehicle, on the first row, you'll see there we have the purchase price. Of course, we need to see what it costs to purchase that vehicle and to get it delivered and on the road and going. On the second line, we see other things that build up the total cost of ownership, the cost to the organisation. So the cost of maintenance and service and insurance and so on. When we come to the third row of the table, we're starting to think life cycle costing, and we're trying to think about other costs beyond the organisation, costs to society, to the environment, but costs that we can quantify. So in the case of a vehicle, we know that there are emissions and there are ways to quantify those. So there's a lot of different tools and data out there on the internet that can measure carbon emissions and can put numbers on those so that they can be built into an evaluation process. So if you want to look at a vehicle and you're buying it to use it for 5 years and it will drive 10,000 miles a year, then you can start quantifying what are the carbon emissions for 50,000 miles of driving this size and type of vehicle. So that can be built into an evaluation. And then in the bottom row of this table, we get to other impacts that are much harder to quantify. So if we have a vehicle which is emitting carbon dioxide, it's causing pollution, that has a knock-on effect on air quality, and that has an effect on health. So the end result of this vehicle could be that somebody ends up in hospital needing hospital treatment. So that is a cost to society. It's a cost to that individual. It's a cost to people running the health service. But of course, that is very hard to quantify. I wouldn't suggest that you try and build that into an evaluation process, but it is worth thinking about. So this tool with its 4 steps is a good approach to use anytime you're starting to think about procurement, because while you may not be able to build in issues from the final row there, you can start thinking about them, and they can then influence your thinking and perhaps thinking about alternatives. So again, to come to this simple example of a car, could you be buying an electric vehicle instead? Could you be looking at actually cutting the amount of travel that's needed so that less vehicles are needed? Can you use online conferencing instead of traveling to meetings and so on? So it's a useful tool to help you think through the implications and the impact they might have. So really, when we talk sustainable public procurement, it's about trying to make the business case and then harnessing that power of public procurement. So anyone who's working in public procurement knows it's huge. Government is one of the biggest buyers anywhere, and it's particularly dominant in certain sectors. So if we're looking at pharmaceuticals or road building or construction of hospitals and schools, then government tends to be the biggest buyer in all those sectors. And that gives it a huge influence to get what it wants from the market. It gives it the power to support development of private markets. So what government wants will affect what the private sector is offering, and products that government demand will often become available to private purchasers too. And government will always focus, or should always focus, on being compliant with policies across government. So in public procurement, we're used to checking that companies are properly registered, that they've complied with tax laws, that they're up to date, that they're VAT registered, and all these kind of things, because it's important to have coherence across government. If one part of government is setting a rule on something, then it's up to other parts of government to make sure that they are complying with that in their purchasing activities. But rather than just taking that approach of compliance, sustainable public procurement can be much more proactive in actually achieving positive impact. So when you think sustainable public procurement, you have the power to influence throughout the supply chain. So if government sets standards that affect the raw materials or the labour standards in the supply chain, then they can be reaching not just to their first level of suppliers, but down the supply chain and having a positive influence throughout that supply chain. And government can really drive innovation. So if government, for example, wants more energy efficient equipment, more water efficient solutions, if they start asking for it, because of their purchasing power, the private sector will start to innovate and will start to try and provide those solutions. So government can have a huge positive impact. And those solutions and innovations that get developed become broadly available, not just to government, but to the whole of society. And then the final, but probably most important point here is that procurement really has the opportunity to proactively support national development priorities. So if one of a country's priorities is to support a marginalised group or a least developed area of the country, procurement can actually proactively do that by giving preference to people in companies in certain groups or suppliers based in certain areas of the country, so they have a real chance to support national development priorities, whatever they might be. Given what we've just said about the potential for procurement to have such positive impact, it's no surprise to see that sustainable procurement is part of the Sustainable Development Goals. So it's one of the targets within goal number 12. So target 12.7 is about promoting public procurement practices that are sustainable in accordance with national policies and priorities. And that's a really important point. So it's not about following a very fixed set of rules. It's about using public procurement to support whatever your national goals and policies are. Beyond that target, it's really important to see that sustainable public procurement can be a tool for achieving any of the other goals, any of the 17 goals. So public procurement works across all sectors. It's in health, it's in education, it's in water and sanitation. And it has the power to work on gender issues and on youth issues and on so many different issues that really it can be a tool that helps a government achieve any of its development goals. Of this section, before we start moving on to the where to start, is just to stop and address a couple of the myths and oppositions maybe to sustainable public procurement. A lot of people will say it's just too expensive. Everything we buy will be more expensive and we don't have the budget for that. Or local suppliers will lose out. All the business will go to suppliers from more developed countries. That doesn't have to be the case at all. So sustainable procurement is very much about driving innovation, driving efficiency. So it can often lead to very positive developments that save money. It can lead to things that are more energy efficient. It can lead to reduced packaging. It can lead to reduced air miles for transporting products. So it doesn't have to be more expensive. And of course, when we think about life cycle costing and start quantifying the true costs to the organisation, then often something that might seem more expensive is going to be a lower cost over its lifetime. And in terms of local suppliers, it's just really important to work with the local market and give them time to adapt and be able to respond to your requirements. So I wouldn't suggest that you issue a tender tomorrow with brand new requirements that have never been there before. It's important to engage with the local market, to consult them on what's possible, to make them aware of what it is that government wants and give them time to adapt. So one strategy that's possible is, instead of making all your sustainability requirements mandatory, in the initial stages, make them optional, make them preferred, give extra points for them or give a price preference for them, but don't cut out people who can't comply. But over time, you can start moving to making it mandatory as you see that the local supply market is able to respond. So having looked a bit at the concept of what is SPP and why is it important, hopefully I've convinced you that it's something you should be doing. But where do you get started? SPP is such a wide topic that can cover every sector, every product, that it can be a bit baffling to know where to get started. So who is going to implement it? Well, one simple answer is everybody, and anybody on this webinar, whatever their role, can find little things that they can do to start making their purchases more sustainable. But on a bigger scale, it is a change process. If a country wants to implement sustainable procurement, that is a reform, it's a change process. So it's really important to find a leader who is going to really champion that change, somebody who's going to stand up and make it clear that government is committed and that it is important. And that leader could come from anywhere. I've put some suggestions here, but there's no kind of set approach. So a lot of countries pick someone from a procurement authority or Ministry of Finance who is responsible for procurement policy. Other countries have started from, say, a Ministry of Environment. So, for example, I know Rwanda and Kenya had initiatives on green public procurement that was focused mainly on environmental issues, and that was driven out of ministries or other organisations focused on the environment. So likewise, if you were focused on some social issues as the priority, there may be another ministry that could lead on that. Or a cross-government working group is always a good idea. So Kenya has recently set up a task force to look at sustainable public procurement, and that's drawing from the Procurement Authority, the Ministry of Finance, the professional body for public procurement, and quite a number of other ministries to bring everybody in. And that's really important because everybody is affected by sustainable public procurement. And it's so important to identify all the different stakeholders, to consult everybody, to raise awareness. So, of course, procurement staff need to understand what's happening. But there are also people who are a lead for a particular policy or a particular technical area. So if you wanted to focus on gender responsive procurement, then you need to talk to whoever's responsible for policy on gender. Likewise, if you're looking at particular products, you will need technical expertise. The private sector, of course, is vitally important. It's really important to be talking to industry groups and talking to local suppliers. And also the oversight bodies and civil society who may audit procurement, who may monitor it, who may investigate complaints. It's really important that they understand if new approaches are being taken. So at the moment, we're starting to consult different government bodies in Ukraine on our sustainable public procurement process. And what the contracting authorities have said to us very clearly is, we are interested in doing this, but we will only participate if you have the National Audit Office or similar bodies involved, so that they know what we're doing and we know that they're okay with it and are not going to criticise us in an audit. So if you've decided who's going to lead this process, the question really is where are you and where do you want to be? So start by assessing your status. Where are you on sustainable public procurement? Now, a lot of countries think they haven't even started, but actually sustainable procurement is not as new as you think. So a lot of people are used to giving price preferences for local suppliers or extra points in RFPs for local consultants. I know that Tanzania and Kenya for quite a number of years have had a target to give more contracts to women-owned businesses and businesses which employ people with disabilities. And they may not have called it sustainable procurement, but that's what it is. It may be focused on an economic or a social pillar, not necessarily environmental, but it's not as new as you think it is. And most countries have already made a start on this, even if they haven't labelled it as such. Really important in thinking about what you want to do that you link in with existing kind of government goals and priorities. Okay, don't just try and do something different. There's usually some kind of national development strategy in place and other policies that procurement can link into. So, for example, I know quite a few of the East European countries have initiatives on energy efficiency and specific legislation on energy efficiency. So that brings a really good link to sustainable procurement and what procurement can do to reinforce that work on energy efficiency. So set some priorities, set some targets, and those priorities might be particular areas. There might be particular products. You might want to set percentage targets on what proportion of procurement processes bring in sustainability requirements. There's no set way of doing it, but the important thing is, think what your targets are and make sure that you can monitor those. So if you've thought what you're going to prioritise, and are you going to start on social issues or particular products or whatever it might be, you can think about the best approach for getting there. And again, there's no fixed way of doing this. There's guidance out there that will tell you how to implement sustainable procurement, but it can very much be tailored to your country and where you are, where you want to go, and the best way for you. So a lot of countries start by drafting some kind of policy on SPP or updating their legislation to bring in some kind of change in their law. Others focus more on some practical guidance. So they say, we don't need to change the law. Let's just write some guidelines on sustainable procurement or how to buy certain products. So Vietnam, for example, I know brought out a number of guidelines on how to do sustainable procurement of office equipment or paper or whatever the products were. And they started on a very practical level to just see what they could do within their existing rules. Some countries, I say, focus on green issues or social issues. Some focus on particular products. Some might just choose a few organisations to do some pilots of SPP rather than trying to introduce across the whole of government at one go. Nothing right or wrong in any of those approaches, but it's something to think about up front. So that was a very brief kind of just a reminder of maybe some issues to think about up front when you're getting started. And I'm going to dig into some of those in a little bit more detail now. So one thing I'd really strongly recommend is to think about developing an action plan. And that could be on a national level for how to implement across the whole country, or it might be on a sector level or just for a particular organisation. You don't have to develop an action plan, but it helps you to be very clear on your focus, your goals, the approaches you're taking, and how that's going to work. As with any action plan, it should come with particular activities and who's responsible and timescales and, you know, how that's going to be monitored. One really important thing for an action plan is to look at the budget and the funding that you might need for that. So to give one example, on the programme I've been working on for the last few years, we worked with the Public Procurement Authority in Tanzania, and we helped them develop an action plan for how to implement sustainable procurement across the country. And their plan was to take that action plan with its budget and to talk to the development partners and to seek funding for particular components of that programme. So for anyone who's in a position where they're not likely to get the budget from their own government and might be dependent on development partners, an action plan is a really powerful tool for showing that you have a commitment and that you have a plan and being able to seek funding to help implement that. Your policy and legal framework. As I just said, you don't necessarily have to update your law. This kind of process doesn't have to start with a lengthy legal process that might get bogged down in Parliament for quite a length of time. But you do need to start about thinking, what can you do within your current procurement law? I know a lot of countries I've worked with tend to think they haven't got sustainable procurement in their law, but when you look, there's usually something in there to work with. So there's usually rules that say that you could build in particular environmental characteristics into a specification, or that you can use life cycle costs to evaluate, or that you can use additional evaluation factors other than cost. So there may well be enough in your procurement law to at least help you get started. But just look, are there any particular barriers? So if your procurement guidance or law says that you should always focus on lowest cost, that can make it quite challenging to implement sustainable procurement. Not impossible, but it will make it more difficult. And then based on where you are, you can make a decision on what to do. Do you need to make some legal revisions? Do you maybe just need to write some guidance to better explain what's allowed within the law? Or do you need to write guidance just on particular products or particular issues? And there's a real question here of whether you legislate and learn or learn then legislate. And what I mean by that is, would you want to update your legislation, implement sustainable procurement, integrate it within the law, and then start applying that law and learn how it goes? Or would you like to start by applying what is possible within your existing law, learning how that goes, and then based on those lessons learned, think about what you need to change in your legislation, or was anything a problem? Okay. And of course, the process isn't just 2 steps. It's probably legislate, learn, legislate again. You know, it's an ongoing reform in that area. But it's something to think about in terms of your current position and what would work for your country. So vitally important, sustainable public procurement is a different way of doing things. So communications and building capacity is really key. So I would recommend working with whoever is already running procurement training in your country. It could be universities, training institutes, civil service training colleges. If they're already educating procurement staff, then get them to build sustainability issues into their existing curriculum. Professional institutions can be really powerful here. So the work I've done in the last few years, both Kenya and Uganda, the professional bodies for procurement have played a huge role in raising awareness. So they've built sustainable procurement into their CPD programs. They've made it a theme at conferences. They've written articles about it in magazines and done a huge amount to raise awareness across all procurement professionals about sustainable procurement. Anything around communications and capacity building really must remember to include the private sector as a really critical part. There's no point educating the procurement officers how to do it if there's nobody who's able to bid for it. And again, as we said before, the audit institutions, civil society who may be monitoring. So it's really important to just engage everybody and make sure everyone's aware. And then as the initiative goes on, share success stories, share what's been learned, share stories which talk about the impact of sustainable procurement. So where you have people who still doubt it and think it's too expensive or local companies are going to lose out, share success stories that show the opposite. Develop tools for SPP. However much people are convinced of its value, it's quite hard to know where to get started. It's quite hard to know what to do for particular products. So I know a lot of countries, so Uganda, for example, has worked quite a lot on standard specifications, starting with some commonly used items like sort of office equipment. And I think the Ministry of Energy has worked on things around lighting and energy efficiency. So if those specifications and criteria are developed, they can then be used across government without everybody having to understand the details of the process, but they have things that they can use. Things can be updated in standard bidding documents, guidance can be issued on particular products. One useful tool is eco-labels, certifications, social labels, and I've put up pictures of a few as examples. So you'll probably recognise the energy efficiency label. Most countries have some sort of energy efficiency rating, and that's something you can use in procurement to say, in this procurement, for this item, we want a minimum energy efficiency rating of C, but perhaps we'll give a preference to products that have B or above. The fair trade label is around labour standards and treatment of workers. And then the Forestry Commission one that you'll see on the top right there is a mix of environmental and social standards. So it's about how timber is harvested and the sustainability of the forests, but it's also around the labour standards for forest workers. Now, on these certifications and eco-labels, they're a really useful source of information and expertise, but don't just introduce them overnight, okay? If local suppliers are not able to comply with them, it will take them a while to move towards it. So a lot of these certifications have quite a long process. It might take a year or two to assess systems, to update them, to get audited, to get a certification. So don't use them without consultation, but it is something that you could tell the local private sector that you are going to move to. From 2026, we expect everyone to be carrying this kind of certification. You can also allow equivalents, and you can also use them as inspiration. So you don't necessarily have to adopt everything from an eco label, but you can look at the criteria that build up that label and pick out things that might be relevant and build those into your evaluation criteria or your specifications. Now, I know a lot of countries have done work on eco-labels alongside sustainable public procurement. So in Eastern Europe, in the EU for Environment programme, I know there's been work on eco-labelling alongside public procurement. So it's an initiative that's well worth thinking about because it gives a kind of shortcut to sustainable standards and makes them easy to define and easy to evaluate who meets them. Into the procurement process. So we've talked about policies and laws and tools and a lot of the preparatory work. Obviously, it comes down to what you do in a procurement process. So I would really recommend prioritizing a few items and then trying to run some pilot tenders rather than trying to do everything at once across every government purchase. So a lot of countries run an exercise to prioritize their products. And the advice I would give would be, don't go for something too big and complex. Don't go for some absolutely critical, high-profile project. But equally, don't go for something that's so small that it makes no difference. You need either items that are commonly used or things that will have a quite a kind of significant impact, or things that are a priority for other reasons. So select some products, work on them, plan out what can be done. And then you'll see on this screen a procurement cycle for sustainable procurement. And I'm not going to talk through every step because I'm sure everyone on this webinar already works in procurement and is very familiar with the procurement cycle. But I wanted to emphasize a couple of things. One, that it's still the same procurement cycle. As I said right at the start, we're not changing things totally. We're building on the public procurement we already know, and we're seeing what we can do a little bit differently and what else we can build in. Another thing I'd emphasize is you need more effort up front. So for sustainable procurement, you need a bit more effort at the front end of the cycle in terms of thinking of alternative solutions. Is there a different way of doing this that would be more sustainable? And putting some effort into engaging the market and consulting them and seeing what's possible. So some of my colleagues recently worked with the Organization for East Caribbean States, and they were helping them on a tender for to award a framework for some building supplies to be used in sort of disaster relief operations, rebuilding. And they helped them run a market engagement exercise to consult local Caribbean suppliers on, what standards they could meet. And what they found from that engagement was that some local suppliers weren't ready to meet some of the sustainability standards that they could have put into that tender. But it was so important that they did that consultation up front, and then that changed the way that they designed their tender, and they didn't make the requirements too stringent so as to not, take local suppliers out of the competition. So it's really important to have that kind of ongoing consultation. As you go around the procurement cycle, obviously, when you come to evaluating, the focus is really going to be not on lowest cost, but what's the best value, what's the most advantageous bid, factoring in all the sustainability issues. And come into contract management, obviously any contract is managed and monitored, but if you have built in particular sustainability requirements, then it's going to be important to make sure there is compliance with those as well. And also to have an open relationship with the supplier to see what's going on, see what's achieved, and to learn. So final step there, if these are pilot tenders, if you're trying something different that you haven't done before, it's really important that you actually assess how it went and that there is a kind of open learning of what went well, what didn't go so well, what can we do differently next time, and that is shared. And that brings me to my final point. Whatever your approach to implementing sustainable procurement, whether you have an action plan, whether you update your law, whatever it says, it's really important that you monitor and learn from what's going on. This is a change process. It can be quite different. So it's important to have, monitoring. So if you have an action plan, monitor progress, see if that's on track, see what's happening. If you're running pilot procurements, make sure you're reviewing how those went and learning from those and sharing. Quite a few countries are looking at how to integrate SPP within their existing system. So Uganda has an e-procurement system, and I know it's been looking at how to be able to monitor SPP within that system by building in extra fields to monitor where there are sustainability requirements in tenders and to be able to measure how much sustainable procurement is happening. And a final but really important point is about continuing to consult everybody. So if you've run a pilot tender, talk to the bidders about how it went. Talk to the people who didn't bid about why they didn't bid, and keep learning and keep sharing the success stories as well. That takes me to the end. I'm sure Suman probably has some questions for me, so I will stop sharing my screen.
Hi, Elinor. It's wonderful, I was so mesmerized just listening to it, a lot to learn, and and there are quite a few questions, there are 14, 15 questions have been asked so far, and I will try to be as fair as we can. And we do have about 15, 17 minutes left, and I'll try to combine some of those questions together, bundle them up, so it will be easy for us to go with it. So it's not in any order. I'm just going to pick randomly in terms of like how I'm trying to compile them. But I just wanted to put few points together before we get into Q&A. So just want to make sure that your presentation was so clear that this sustainable procurement is not just about being a green procurement. It's about innovation. It's about the way how we can help local economies and local efficiency, corporate social responsibilities, etc. And I think you touched I think you gave an example of couple countries where there are kind of set aside practices that we have in the US. And I think it's really important from developing a local capacity in sustainable procurement. So with that, I will just go ahead straight to the question, unless you have something to add, Elinor.
You're right, it can cover so many issues, and that's a brilliant thing. It's flexibility, but it's also a challenge to kind of know where to start. But let's go ahead with the questions.
So the one question is from Jay Madigan. I may mispronounce your name, so I'll just apologize for that from the very beginning. So can we touch on a tender process which challenges ownership from the government to the private sector?
A
Uh,
tender process that touches on.
Touches the tender process where it changes the ownership from the government to the private sector. So we're talking about the public procurement, so that's a government procurement. So I think he meant by the private sector, and he added one more. So vendor being pre-qualified for several years can help everyone in sustainable procurement. So they like mentorship by the by someone like your company or some other companies to a new company or the small businesses. Yeah.
Okay, I'm not sure if I fully understood the
Think he's
question.
like how this tender process, how the procurement can move from the public sector to private sector and still be uh, sustainable procurement.
Okay, in terms of private sector companies doing their own procurement. Yeah. Okay. I mean, the same principles apply. I've been talking very much about public procurement, but there's no reason why private companies can't adopt the same approaches and the same principles. And what we'll also see is that if government is setting certain standards in its procurement, then the private sector companies further down the supply chain are going to need to comply with certain requirements. So even if it's a company to company purchase and someone buying raw materials or component parts, within the private sector, they may be setting higher standards because their ultimate client is the government.
So there's another one. The follow-up question is next question is from Mr. Jallo from I think Sierra Leone. Is it possible to apply SPP in donor-funded projects? Yes, absolutely. And do you want to say a few things on that?
Yeah, it's absolutely possible in any procurement. As I said, it's always good to start with assessing what the legal rules are. I would say virtually all of the development partners have sustainability built into their procurement guidelines. So you can look for the specifics in each partner's guidelines, but I would be very surprised if they excluded use of it. There is usually freedom to build whatever factors you want into into a specification. There's usually freedom to put certain factors into evaluation, whether it's life cycle costing, things you can quantify, or using points to give preference. A lot of the development partners have for many, many years awarded preferences for local companies or in consultancy for those who are working with local consultants. Yeah, and a lot of the development partners will require upfront planning, say large construction projects. They will need environmental impact assessments and things which give the information to help inform a sustainable public procurement process. So absolutely possible.
So there's another very interesting question. I think you covered it already, but I just want to come to that question is how can a student or someone new to procurement effectively approach sustainable public procurement, and what are the key principles to focus on? And I think you covered it very well, and I will say a few things on there. I think it's really important for government or any entity to invest on capacity building. That's really, really key and engage with suppliers to build strong relationship, so that this capacity building will encourage students or someone new to adopt this SPP from very beginning. And I know, Eleanor, do you have? I think you have tons of answers, long answers for that. So I'll leave it to you. So how can?
Maybe just to add, it's my presentation today is quite general. I was trying to share some general lessons and approaches, but every procurement process is different. So when you're starting to look at it, it's important to think about what is it you're buying, what are the issues, what are the risks, what are the opportunities about a particular product, and also the context that you're working in. So depending on which organization you're working for, which country you're in, what are the issues that matter, what are the development priorities, what matters there.
And yes, absolutely. And then there's some quite a few comment by Yocasta Santos. And if you can see the Q&A, I think I would like people to read those comments. I'll try to summarize those comments a little later. But there's a question by her is, we understand the environment, social and economic aspect must be a part of evaluation criteria. I believe that by leaving these as a plus, it is very easy to stop considering them. What do you think?
I think it's important that we remember we can't consider every aspect in every procurement. So it's important with each procurement to plan, are we looking at environmental, social, economic issues? And within each of those three pillars, there are so many things to focus on, which is where I'd come back to what are the priorities for your government or your organization, but also what is relevant to the product you're buying. And you have to be careful not to ask for something that's impossible. If you want something that comes from a local supplier and it's not manufactured in the local market, then you might be asking for the impossible. And this comes back to the market research, engagement with the market, planning.
And there's one very valuable comment here to mention is, countries should use international treaties and conventions that they are approved and signed by each countries in favor, like to adopt sustainable public procurement. I think that's been a practice. People are looking into it, and one of the very important component to that is fundamental human rights. So do you have any comment on that? Do you have any example to that, Eleanor, where people have followed the international treaties and conventions, they're approved or signed to follow the SPP?
Yeah, I mean, there can be international conventions relevant on all kinds of things. So like the ILO has some around labor standards that could be built in. There's all sorts of different ones. And, often if a country is signed up to that convention, it might be useful to write those kind of issues into general conditions of contract in a standard bidding document to make sure that they're always built in, depending a bit on the issue, how it's best adopted. But, this is where a procurement authority or a similar body can kind of build some of these issues into its standard bidding documents and its other tools and guidelines.
And Suadu has a question. Some organizations face a lack of knowledge regarding sustainability and sustainable procurement. How can you address this? So Suadu, I mentioned earlier too, and I think Elinor touched it multiple times, directly or indirectly. It's a capacity building training, and just be aware of it. So do you have any suggestion on that? How can these countries or different authority can address lack of knowledge or building capacity on SPP?
Yeah, I mean, certainly needs a big capacity building effort. I talked about how we've worked with training institutions and professional institutions. So find the bodies that are in a good position to kind of reach out, because there's so many people to reach. What are the vehicles for reaching them? Is it a professional body? How do you raise awareness? There's also huge amounts of tools and information on the internet. And there's a lot of sector specific programs and a lot of different websites out there with information.
So there's another question. I was a little reluctant, but I'll go ahead and ask because you have worked in so many African countries. So this is by Brian. How do the prevailing leadership styles in Africa, often characterized by hard leadership, influence the dogmas and practices surrounding public procurement? and what reforms are necessary to align these practices with sustainable development goals?
I mean, any kind of change process, such as bringing in sustainable procurement, has obviously got to take account of the political context and what are priorities for government. But I think I said in my presentation, I would very much recommend that you link into existing development strategies and what are priorities. So one of the countries I've worked with over the last few years was Colombia, and the government is very keen on what it calls the popular economy. It's very much focused on social issues. So we helped pilot some tenders that had evaluation criteria favouring single parent families and other social groups that were seen as in need of support. And that very much worked in Colombia, given the political agenda and what was important there. In another country, it may be a different approach to take. But I think we said it's really important to find somebody who will lead a sustainable public procurement initiative and will really kind of champion it and make sure any policies or legal changes come through. But there's other ways to get the message out there, as we said, through professional institutes. So it needs to be considered in the context of each country.
So there's Lydia has a concern that how do government in procurement sector clear the issue of generic drugs in pharmacies, and why do we stop the government from its production and distribution? So this is I think pretty governments like you said, it has to be aligned with the government's what you call the policy or their vision, right? So I don't know. I'll let you answer that.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is just an issue around sustainable procurement. This sounds like an issue around rules on regulation of drugs and whether generic alternatives are permitted. That sounds to me. I certainly have colleagues who work much more in this area, and I'd be happy to put Lydia in touch to talk about those issues.
So, even if you have questions after this, you can send us an email and I will make sure that she gets that questions and we'll try to answer as many as we can. And there's a question that please explain the nexus between sustainable development and sustainable procurement. I think that's a pretty interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, sustainable development, obviously, it's a different path for every country. As I said, every country will probably have its kind of strategies and policies around sustainable development. And it's really important that sustainable public procurement is linking in with that and not trying to go a different way. So I would always say the starting point in coming up with any kind of plan for sustainable procurement is to look at what the broader development strategy for the country is and to find those issues that are important.
And I want to thank Yocasta Guzman Santos for putting very valuable comments in this discussion. And I'm not going to read all the comments, but one of the things that really stood out to me is how she has recognized that other countries like in US, the large companies are sometimes required to contract out to the small businesses, or some contracts are set aside for the small businesses or women or veterans or other minority communities, people with disabilities, and etc. And I think they are really good practices. She really recognizes it and she adds up. I know, Elinor, you talked about some countries' example in this, but I think the Dominican Republic, I believe she's from there. They also practice this since 2013, which includes business, women, family, agriculture, people with disabilities, etc. So I think that those are really good practices, and we know it has worked in many countries, and it's just a matter of trying, and it will work in local context. And I think that's the only question. I think we already answered all the questions. There are lots of comments, and you can read it. So before we close, we are right at the top of the hour. So I will give it back to you to see if you have any final words to say, and then I'll do the closing.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to thank you again for the opportunity to present today. And just to say that I could see there's some really useful comments in the chat there, and I'll go through more of them afterwards. But so it is very much different for every country. So I'd be really happy if you connect with me on LinkedIn, find me on the Genesis website, connect, because it's always really good to hear examples from other countries beyond those that I've worked in. Thank you.
So with that, I will just go over a little bit more about our housekeeping, what I said. So tomorrow morning, you're going to get a questionnaire in email with a link to the YouTube recording, so you can share with your colleagues. And as this session is being recorded, and I would like to get some feedback from you on this, and you can suggest some topics that you think are really important for you, and we will prioritize and we will see if we can accommodate those topics in our coming months in 2025. And I will also share our LinkedIn link here on this page, on this chat group, so you can connect with us. And we do produce papers, blog, and other stuff in this LinkedIn, and take advantage of it. And I don't have any other question. I think questions are all taken care of. I'll just give it a final shot here if there is any question left. No, I think we are all. No, there's one uh, question. Yeah, there's one last question. Let's take this one from Nepal by Salikram Kalathoki. As Nepal is currently revising the Public Procurement Act, do you have any suggestions in this regard to address procurement issues? So, probably anything about sustainability.
Yeah, I mean, certainly it's really good to see sustainability as an objective of a law, because then even if there's not much detail, if it's in there as an objective, it's easier to then bring out in lower level regulations or guidelines if needed. But there's a lot that can be built in. I mean, I'd be happy to connect and see how we could help you in terms of specifics that can be built in around the different steps of the procurement process.
And I just want to add that we have been, my colleague is here online, Parshu. So we have been working a lot in Nepal in public procurement. Right now, we focus on energy sector a lot with MCC and USAID project. So reach out to us and see what we can do. And we just completed one with US Trade Department working with your procurement authority. And so we'll be happy to be engaged. Thank you all, and just wish you all a very, very happy holidays and happy new year, whatever you celebrate towards the end of the year. Take some break, and we'll see you in January. Thank you, Elinor, and thank you, Susanna, for helping me. My colleague is there. She's behind the scene helping us all. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.